Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Meg Alexander. I'm so happy to be joining you for another exciting Power to Fly Chat and Learn virtual event. Now, before we dive in today, I just want to say hello and welcome to all of our participants. One thing that you should know about today's event, like all of our virtual events, is that they are all about you. It's about our community members and making sure that you all not only get great content from us, resources, information, but you enjoy the time that you spend with us. So if you took time out of your day to be here with us for our recording and live stream of today's event, we want to make sure that it's worth the time you took out of your day to do that. So you are welcome to participate in any way you would like to. There are a couple different options. You can always turn your cameras on if you would like to share your smiling, maskless faces with us safely. Please understand there is no pressure to be Instagram perfect, y'all. I am on day 4 of the messy bun, dry shampoo, power punch combo. So whether you are joining us from a corner office or your couch in your living room, does not matter. We want to meet you where you are. If you do have any kind of privacy concerns, do not worry. As long as you don't come off mute during today's session, you will not show up on the live recording or the live stream. So no worries there. Now, if you do want to participate, but you don't want to come on camera, again, not a requirement. You can do it however you like, but you can always send in any questions or comments you might have into the group chat. If you would like to ask a question or raise a comment and be kept anonymous, you can always DM your question or comment to me. You'll find my name, Meg Alexander, in the drop-down menu there. Now, I'm happy to raise questions or comments, keep you anonymous, doesn't matter. Just know that if you don't ask, I don't know you want to know. So please feel free, let us know the answers that you are hoping to get from today's event. Now, like I said, today's session is being recorded as well as live streamed. And what that means for you is that you get to kick back and relax. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to worry if you missed a reference or a link that someone shared. You will always be able to go back and rewatch this recording. Now, everybody that registered for today's event is going to get an email from Power to Fly in about 1 to 2 business days. And it's going to have a rewatch link to where you can watch this recording on our website when it's posted there. But let's say that Lex has something just like mind-blowing to share with you today, and you cannot wait the 1 to 2 business days to tell a friend or a coworker or a relative. You don't have to. You can always head over to our YouTube channel. I'll be sharing links for all of this with y'all in the chat in just a couple minutes here, but you can head over to our YouTube channel. The recordings are usually posted there within about 5 to 15 minutes of the end of the actual live stream. And you can search a huge section of our recorded chats of our archives on that YouTube channel. Now, I will recommend that you check it out on our website, because our website has the absolute full archives. Every event that has happened from the beginning of Chat and Learns till today is up there. So if you would like to search that full archive, obviously head over and check out our website as well. Now, I did recommend or did mention that we are on YouTube, but we are also on various other social media platforms. We are at Power to Fly on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So what I want to highlight for all of you about that is that we share great content, resources, job postings, all kinds of information on those various platforms. And if you would like to, please feel free to let us know that you are learning with Power to Fly. Take photos or video as we go, share it out to your social media network. Anything we can do to grow our community, we want to do, because it enables us to get these resources for free, mind you, in the hands of as many people as possible. So please feel free to share, share that you are learning with us. We would love to repost, retweet, or reshare whatever y'all tag us in. So please feel free. Now, as we continue on, I'm really excited to introduce you to today's speaker. Now, Lex Horwitz is a queer, non-binary, transgender, Jewish, nationally recognized, and award-winning LGBTQ+ educator, activist, consultant, and public speaker based out of Philly and New York City. I was going to say North Carolina, y'all. This is a bad day for English, which is sad when it is the only language you speak. So, to learn a little bit more about Lex, Lex received their BA in psychology and gender, as well as sexuality and women's studies from Bowdoin College, where they competed on the varsity men's squash team and became the first out transgender athlete in all of collegiate squash, as well as the first out transgender athlete to compete at Bowdoin. Now, through their work, Lex cultivates a powerful, judgment-free space where all people can engage in critical conversation on gender, sexuality, and community, and become effective allies in action to the LGBTQ+ community. Lex, I am so happy to have you join us today. I can't wait to dive in on these questions. But is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience? Anything they should know about you, your background, anything before we dive in here?
Yeah, so first I want to say thank you so much to everyone who's tuning in live and watching the recording, whenever that may be. I'm just super grateful to be here, and it's incredible to be able to engage in these conversations and to really help folks learn and grow. And so, because we only have an hour, there is always going to be more that we can do to stay educated, to keep critically thinking about all these topics. And so, if there is something that we were not able to address or go into depth on, or you have questions, I have a lot of available resources for free on my website as well. I know at the end, we're going to be sharing more about that. Just all of this is to say that you are not alone. This work will continue post our chat and learn, and I'm here to be a resource. And that truly, as we're getting into all of the topics here, if you do have questions and you would like to ask them here or after the fact, this is a space for everyone to be able to learn and grow together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lex. Now, last thing we're going to talk about before we dive into questions are some of the main takeaways you can expect to get today. Now, we identified these from conversations with Lex, as well as by looking at the questions that you all submitted when you registered for this session. Now, all of that to say, these are the issues or some of the topics we're going to try and cover today. But since you took time out of your day to spend with us, we want to make sure that you have the power to drive today's conversation. So if you have questions that you'd like to expand on a topic or an idea or a certain term, please feel free, shout it out into that Zoom group chat. If you asked a question during registration and you're not sure if we'll get to it today, ask it in the group chat. If we are going over one of your questions and you want to give us additional details, context, info, anything like that, let us know. Send it in that group chat. We want to know. Again, you are always free to ask questions or add comments in the group chat. You can also do it, DM me if you want them to be kept anonymous. Doesn't matter the reason, happy to do that for you. So anytime, y'all, feel free, send early, send often. That is the best way to get the answers that you came for today. So we're going to talk about some foundational educational content that'll help to get kind of people up to speed about the areas of gender and sexuality. We're going to discuss how these inclusive strategies can be put into practice, as well as how you can do this as an ally. And then we're also going to discuss what self-advocacy might look like in the workplace if you are part of this community, or if you are just trying to advocate for yourself in general. Now, Lex, to kick us off, let me stop sharing my screen here. So to kick us off, we had a lot of really, really great questions that were sent in. But the first one that I at least want to start with here is let's kind of nail down some of the basics. What are some of the basic things like level setting that we should know going into today's event, especially around areas like gender and sexuality, which can be very confusing topics for you or for people if they've not had to do any research on this since maybe like some of us since like 5th grade.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always it's always where I start, because in order to, whether it's self-advocate or to be an ally in action to the LGBTQIA plus community, we have to start from the same foundation. Because how can we engage in conversation or come from the same place of understanding if we don't start with that language foundation? So definitely want to start us off there. And also, prior to diving in, 2 things I do want to note. So as you know, I am coming to you virtually, and so land acknowledgement. So I'm in Philadelphia, which is on Lenape land. And then also the piece about my educational background and my lived experience. So I love that I have both the academic background in gender, sexuality, and women's studies and psychology, and then also my lived experience as a queer, trans, non-binary person, because I'm able to speak to both pieces together. And so as we all have many multitudes and different lived experiences and identities, even for folks who may share some of those identity terms, our lived experiences look different. So that's why when we're talking today, especially with foundational information, even with questions, knowing that your specific lived experience and background will fully impact your ability to, and how you're able to put into action the different language tools, the different best practices, as I call them. And that no matter where you're coming from, so whether you are able to be out at work or not, or only able to be out with one or a few individuals who you feel safe with, no matter what your out status may be, you are extremely valid in who you are and being able to navigate the space in the way that is safest and most affirming for you. So I want to make sure that before we dive into all this amazing information and education and conversation, that folks know that you are extremely valued no matter where you are and where are you on your life path. And also that there's always room for us to grow. So whether you are queer or trans or straight or cis, no matter where you are, this information is helpful for us to understand who we are as individuals and our own identities, and then also being able to put that into practice for that self-advocacy piece or for advocating for queer folks as well. And so foundational information, super important, starting with the same language base so that we can understand gender and sexuality in inclusive and expansive ways. So to start with gender, gender is 3 different component identities that are different from each other, and the interplay of them connects to the beauty and diversity that we know as gender today. And so gender is a social construct as well. Very important to know. So gender is something as a social construct that we have defined, created, and upheld, which means that it is a human-made categorization. There is no such thing as a generalizable or universal statement that rings true for every single culture or society about gender identity, gender expression, sex, or gender roles. And that's because gender is placed in its very specific historical, time, cultural, and environmental context. And so as a social construct, that doesn't mean that gender isn't real. It is very much so real. It has a direct and indirect impact on every single individual, whether you are cis or trans or queer or straight. And so the language that we're using today in understanding gender and sex and sexuality as social constructs means that as categories and identities that we all have, we have also the power to continue to adapt and modify and expand our understanding of gender and sexuality to be able to be as inclusive and affirming as possible. Because our goal at the end of the day is, how do we be the most affirming to LGBTQIA plus individuals, with the mission of cultivating these inclusive and affirming spaces at work and beyond. And what does that look like? That looks like having all folks be seen and represented authentically, and so that they are able to be in spaces where they are treated with dignity and respect. So those are our missions and our goals connected to understanding gender and sexuality in inclusive and expansive ways. So now specifically with gender, gender's 3 component pieces are gender identity, gender expression, and sex. And sex can be then further differentiated by someone's sex assigned or designated or presumed at birth, which may or may not be the same as their authentic sex or their current sex. And so as 3 different identities, they each have their own definitions and their own terms. Commonly, when we talk about gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sex will be misconflated or believed to be the same. So gender identity terms may be used when we talk about sex, or sex terms for gender. And so in going through each of their definitions and the terms that we use when we talk about gender identity, gender expression, and sex, that is a starting point for us to all build our foundation. One, in understanding all of these as greater than binaries to be inclusive. And also when we're looking at putting all of this information into best practice, so whether that is in conversation, so how we are talking about our identities and being expansive and using the appropriate terminology, or in writing when we look at policies or a website, or when we're filling out forms online or advocating for greater definitions or options to be able to be seen and affirmed. It's so important for us to be able to use this information in that expansive way. And so setting the groundwork there, gender identity is your innermost concept of self. So it is who you know yourself to be and who you are. And so only you know your gender identity. No one can tell you what your gender identity is. And so when we talk about gender identity, the terms that we may use, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just some that we may use are, if you are a woman, man, non-binary, genderqueer, agender, gender fluid, gender expansive, two-spirit, pangender, and so many other terms. So when we're talking about gender identity, our innermost concept of self, we would want to make sure you're using gender identity terms. Also, some folks may use more than one gender identity term, such as being a genderqueer non-binary person, a gender fluid man, or any combination of all gender terms. So that's gender identity. And then we have gender expression. So gender expression is how someone chooses to externally present themselves. That is their appearance. That could be clothing, haircut, mannerisms, and behavior. The terms that we use when we talk about gender expression, that external presentation of ourselves, feminine, masculine, and androgynous. And so also all of these are based in that specific cultural context. So what that looks like for us in 2020 in Western culture for femininity and masculinity is actually different than what it was like in Western culture in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Same when we look across cultures for how we're understanding both gender expression, gender identity, and sex. And then, of course, we have sex. So at birth, infants are typically assigned a sex based on the appearance of their external anatomy. However, someone's sex is actually a combination of bodily characteristics, and that includes chromosomes, hormones, internal and external reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics. So when we talk about sex, at birth, we are assigned or presumed or designated a sex based off of only one of many factors of what our actual sex is. And the terms that we use when we talk about sex are female, male, intersex, and non-binary. And so it's important for us to understand sex as more than the appearance of external anatomy and the combination of bodily characteristics. Also to note that intersex is an umbrella term, so that includes folks whose bodies have natural variations that do not fit neatly into the binary categories of female and male bodies. And so when we look at our definitions of gender identity, gender expression, and sex, and we see that each of these identities have their own terms, we can start to work against that conflation of gender identity and sex, or gender expression and gender identity. Because we do not know someone's gender identity just by looking at them, or their gender expression, or their sex. These are all aspects of identity that come together to create the gender diversity that we know. And in order to be affirming and respectful of people, we have to be able to acknowledge when we are making our own assumptions and not act on those assumptions, and to be able to engage in conversation to learn what the affirming language is, name pronouns, and identity terms for individuals. And then when we're asking for gender, using gender identity terms, asking for sex, sex terms, gender expression terms. Also, a note is that it is almost never relevant or important for anyone to ask someone what their sex is. That is most likely only important if it is based off of a medical or legal form, and also kept confidential. And so if someone is asking you or other individuals about their sex, potentially they are asking about gender. So you can check in and say, oh, you're asking about gender identity, which is gender identity or gender expression. If someone is asking about your sex, that is personal, that is private information, and you also do not owe anyone an answer regardless of what their question is, whether it's about sex or gender. So a big aspect of self-advocacy and also just being affirmed in spaces is knowing that you do not owe anyone a reason, an explanation, or an answer, especially if it is not something that feels comfortable for you as an individual. So yeah, wanted to set the groundwork there with our definitions that we are not conflating identity, and then also knowing that with gender, there are the adjectives cisgender and transgender. So folks who are cisgender, and both of these terms are telling us what someone's relationship to their gender and identity and sex are currently, and how they relate to their gender and sex that they were assigned at birth. And so cisgender refers to folks whose gender identity and sex align with the gender identity and sex they were assigned at birth. So there are cisgender women and cisgender men. And transgender, also an adjective. Trans refers, and it's an umbrella term, and it refers to folks whose gender identity and or sex do not align with the gender identity and or sex that they were assigned at birth. Importantly, trans is not limited to the binary. There are non-binary folks such as myself who are also trans. And when we look at, so there are then non-binary trans folks, trans men, trans women, gender expansive trans folks, you name it, it is an umbrella term. And so both cisgender and trans folks have their gender identity, which we just looked at there, and have a sexuality. So when we break away from gender, as gender is separate from sexuality, sexuality or sexual orientation is someone's inherent or immutable, enduring, romantic, emotional, or physical attraction to others. And so attraction is on a spectrum. Some folks may experience all three forms of attraction, whether that's romantic, emotional, or physical. Some folks may experience one or two or none. So when we're looking at that, that's folks who may be asexual or aromantic. Also knowing that regardless of someone's sexuality, no one needs to have had experience in order to know what their sexuality is. Sexuality is purely based on self-identification and attraction, not based off of action. And so we must, and similarly, we must trust and also respect when people say that these are their gender identity, these are their sexualities, and honor what terms they're using and how they know themselves to be, because that's something that only they know and then can share with us. then we can be supportive and allies and create these inclusive and affirming spaces using that information. So that was our little quick snippet on sexuality as well, so that as we're talking about supporting the LGBTQIA plus community, we are aware of attraction being more than just physical. We are aware that gender, as gender identity, gender expression, and sex are more than binaries and are different identities that come together and have this interplay. And that cisgender and transgender folks both have gender identities and sexualities, and that all of these concepts of gender impact every individual, whether you are queer or straight, or queer, straight, trans, or cis, and that the spaces that we want to cultivate at work for ourselves or beyond work, we would use this language and put that into practice in using gender neutral language, removing binary or gendered language where we can. What things can we do to visibly support the queer community in posters or stickers or flags? What are ways in which we can update written language on website, policy, email? How do we share our pronouns and affirming names? How do we protect people's identities if they are only out in certain settings and making sure that we are keeping them safe? What does both a virtual workspace look like in affirmation? Like, what can we do to our walls or in writing our pronouns in our Zoom signature? And how might that change when we go into an office, when there are potential spaces such as restrooms or locker rooms or a kitchen, right? So no matter where we are, how are we navigating physical space, and what language are we using? Or how is our lack of correcting someone using inappropriate language going to impact in the same way as a silence would impact? And so how can we be aware of all of these different factors that come into play and actively create the spaces that we are all a part of, whether virtual or in person? And so I will pause myself there because I have the list of the questions and how they turn into best practice, but want to make sure that if anyone has questions about language definitions before we dive into now what does actual self-advocacy look like, or how to be an ally, because being an ally is a verb. And so there is no such thing as an ally without action. So that's why I always say ally in action. And that action is not something that happens once or every once in a while. It is a daily practice. It is something that we must always be doing. And I can give examples of how that looks. Yeah.
Excellent. Ooh, thank you. Okay, so we do have some people in the chat asking if you've got slides or a cheat sheet that they can reference to remind themselves of these kind of important distinctions after the webinar. So if that's something that you would be comfortable sharing with people, we can do that during the rewatch emails. When those all go out, we can share that kind of stuff with them. But if not, like I said earlier, you can always go back and rewatch this session. There's going to be text at the bottom of the screen because there'll be live transcript, all that kind of stuff. So I definitely recommend you can always go back and rewatch this. Lex, I know you had told me that you do usually do this with slides. So is that something you'd be open to? It's totally fine to say no.
Yeah, I have to just check everything. So typically when I work with different communities, I bring in a specific curriculum for what they want to work on. So if I'm working with a medical center or educational institution or nonprofit or business, I pretty much bring that same foundational information together and we put it into that specific context. So I do bring curriculum in that capacity, so I can check and get back to you. But if not, I do have resources on my website, and also I'm available to help folks via email, whichever capacity would be helpful. But also, if this is, the hope is, of course, right, this is helpful information. It's building that foundation so that we can use this in practice in our workspace or in whichever communities we are a part of. So you belong to a gym or a theater or whatever it may be, and you want to be able to engage in this conversation or have these resources, that's also something that I would love to be able to support you in. So that's something that post our event today, we can collaborate on bringing these resources into each of your individual communities. And so absolutely, please let me know, reach out, because as I said, this is our springboard, our launch pad for engaging in this conversation.
Great, thank you. All right, now just to put a nice cap on what we were talking about with kind of differentiating terms and that kind of stuff. I haven't had to do this explainer in a couple years, which is kind of great. It's really excellent for me that I haven't had to dust it off in a while. But I remember trying to explain this basic idea to my parents and trying to get them to understand that something like gender is how you feel about yourself, how you want other people to see you in the world, whereas sexuality is more around the lines of who are you attracted to, that kind of thing. And so to kind of separate the two, because I feel like for a lot of people, it gets confusing. Would you say that huge oversimplification is still vaguely accurate? Or is that something that I absolutely need to put into my closet of like, nope, they're not good metaphors anymore. We're done with that.
Yeah, no, that is a great way of understanding both. And also it does make it kind of confusing for folks because our LGBTQIA acronym brings together both gender and sex terms and sexuality. And as we were talking about before, gender in its three component pieces is different from sexuality. So gender is personal, right? It's who you know yourself to be. And then sexuality is interpersonal. It's how you're relating to other people. And every person having a gender and having their sexuality as two different identities as well. And also the fact that someone's gender may be that they don't have a gender, so being agender, and someone's sexuality may be that they do not experience sexual attraction or romantic attraction. And so there's those pieces there as well. And also the fact that no one is ever too young or too old to continue to gain a authentic and full understanding of their own identities. And so whether that looks like different identity terms shifting or expanding, adding new terms as you are kind of building this inclusive understanding of who you are and this more complex understanding of identity, there's always space for that growth there too, whether within gender or sexuality.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for diving in on this with us. Okay, so we're gonna take a leap into our questions here. A lot of people had specific questions regarding allyship and how to be allies. This person had written in saying the LGBTQIA plus community at my company has said that it is, quote, not safe to be out here. As an ally, what can I do that would start to build safety and trust for this community so that they feel safe to be included?
Absolutely. So some tools that I have put into practice and have worked with communities on have to do with how can we be both attentive to what's happening in our environment and bring intention into those spaces as well. And so in order to actively impact the environment that we are a part of, it takes this conscious action. And so that starts with language. So language is the primary way through which we understand our world, we engage with and interact and communicate with others. So I always want us to start with allyship being rooted in the affirming and inclusive and expansive language. And as we're talking about what does that look like virtually, so if that is through Zoom or email conversations, what does it look like in person if you're in a meeting or at someone's desk, whatever that may be. Then also, what does that look like if it's in writing? So are there email blasts? Do you have a website or a blog? What type of forms are being sent out and need to be completed by individuals? And what realms do those exist in? And so the starting point is that we want to be proactive and not reactive in how we are advocating for the community. Now, of course, if an instance or a challenge arises, it's very important to be reactive to that challenge that exists, but also being attentive and intentive in this space as an ally. What would it look like for you to be proactive? So in your workspace, what are the current resources or policies that are in place? Have you reviewed them? As you're reviewing them, are you seeing that they are using outdated or binary language? Are you able to then provide edits or speak with the folks who were responsible for publishing these different pieces and say, here's the inclusive language, or I want to work with, if you have a ERG or other type of resource group, or you want to bring in a consultant or public speaker or educator such as myself to say, hey, here are some areas that the language can be updated so that everyone is included, right? So how do we be proactive in seeing what already exists and then seeing where those gaps are and seeing what either needs to be created because it's not there or needs to be updated so that it actually is inclusive and comprehensive of all people. So there's the need to be proactive and looking at where challenges may arise and how we can be inclusive. And then there's also the piece of it's important to be aware of the culture and the climate that currently exists at your workplace and seeing if that is impacting the folks who are comfortable being out at work or not. And so something that I think is so unbelievably telling is that when we look at our population statistics, so also any population stats that discuss the queer community and trans community drastically underrepresent us because of the one challenge in, well, the first piece being that for trans and non-binary folks, especially gender expansive folks, there aren't even questions on any type of census that acknowledges our existence. So in that way, it's very difficult to get actual numbers of queer and trans and non-binary folks.
Well, and this is the binary that you were discussing, right? The fact that this is a spectrum. It's not like a set of choices.
Yes, exactly. So understanding all identities as expansive outside of the binary. And so when we look at specifically within the US, the context that I'm a part of, that the adult population, LGBTQ plus population is over 7%. But then when we look at Generation Z, over 20% of Generation Z adults, so those ages 18 to 23, 24, identify as LGBTQ plus. And that is not because queerness is new or queerness is a trend or younger people are more queer than older generations. That is not the case. The difference is that the culture and the environment that we have created for our youth has resulted in people being welcomed and safe and affirmed to the point where they are able to live as their authentic selves at school, at work, still experiencing so much of the discrimination and stigma as earlier generations have. But the culture and the climate has shifted to such a inclusive or more inclusive and expansive degree that we're seeing these numbers increase. So important note that there are not necessarily, it's not that there are more queer youth, but it has everything to do with the culture that people are as allies, as queer and trans folks, actively putting in the work to make sure that people are included in all those spaces. And so that just shows the power of inclusive language, of checking in with folks to see what does affirmation look like for you. Because it's not enough to simply, I mean, this is a starting point, to simply find welcoming or create welcoming environments, but where do we then jump from we're welcoming and now people are thriving and now people are able to be authentic. It's safe to be out at work. And also knowing that depending on what city or town you're in, what state, what country, how large your company is, what type of resources exist, what policies are in place, are you in a private or a public sector? There are so many different pieces that will impact how you're able to be an ally and advocate for queer folks. And I would even argue in many cases where it is not as safe to be out as queer, that allies need to be able to use their privilege as being a part of the majority population to then advocate on behalf of queer people, because queer people are going to then bear the burden of more stigma, more discrimination, especially when there are not policies in place to protect them, whereas allies, as not members of the community, but supporters of the community, have more protections in those capacities as well. So those are all just kind of larger picture pieces to pull together. But as an ally, it's so important that we start with gender neutral, gender inclusive language, right? The virtual space, in conversation, physical space, and in writing. So in every instance where there is a gendered term, there is, I promise you, and promises are very important to keep, but I promise you that there are gender neutral terms. And in using gender neutral terms, you are including everyone. But when we use, whether indirectly or by accident, whatever it may be, gendered terms such as ladies and gentlemen or sir or ma'am, when we're using those, you're including women and men, but you are inherently, directly and indirectly excluding anyone who exists outside of the gender binary. When you instead say folks or everyone or esteemed guests or colleagues or insert y'all or all, any gender inclusive for all people present, right? When we use that gender inclusive language, you're including the men and women, but you're also inherently creating this space where you're showing that all people are welcomed and included in the language that you're using. So that is also when we're talking about pronouns, rather than saying his or her, whether that I've in many cases seen his/her, and then kind of finishing the sentence, you can simply use their.
Yeah.
If you're describing a person, rather than saying, oh, the man or the woman in the purple top, you say the person in the purple top. There is always going to be a descriptor that can be gender neutral. And that's also when we're talking about familial or relational terms. So rather than mom, dad, parent, brother, sister, sibling, aunt, uncle, so many options here. Auntie, baba, titi. When we're talking about niece, nephew, there's nibbling, sib kid. There are so many. And when we're talking about our relationships, there's girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, date person, spouse could be and is the best practice to use instead of husband and wife, right? So there's spouse, love person, you name it. There are always going to be these inclusive terms. And so what can we do as allies or as members of the community to incorporate this language in our casual conversation or in our policies and our practices? So in forms, rather than asking someone for if they have a husband or wife to say, do you have a spouse? Rather than saying, who is your mom and who is your dad? Acknowledging that some folks have multiple parents, whether that is however their family structure came to be, and saying parent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fill in the blank. So what are the ways in which we're asking people for the information that we may need to be able to affirm them or simply have that information for whatever capacity it's needed, but also not limiting it to binary understandings or keeping it as something that is cis normative or heteronormative within those spaces as well.
I like that. Okay. So let's kind of break this down on, let's say, like a functional level. So I've just walked into work and you are going to be my newest teammate. I've never met you before. What is the best practices to ask someone what terms they would prefer, how they would like to be referred to? I feel like this is a stumbling block that a lot of people get to because they don't know how to ask the question without potentially being, risking being non-inclusive or being, saying something wrong, right? People are very nervous about this and they want to make a good first impression. What would you recommend somebody say if they are meeting their colleague for the first time and they are not sure?
Absolutely. So this can look many different ways. And one of the best practices that I think keeps everything simple, and also it's something that you want to make sure that is becoming a habit. So it's not something that solely happens because you have heard from this new employee, or for whatever reason, you're only asking a certain type of person these questions. You want to be asking every individual these questions. So every new hire, or at a team meeting where you haven't checked in a while, we're making sure that it's something that's not targeting people who you think, whether it's based off an assumption or whatever it may be, are queer or trans. You're asking everyone, because it's also in making that a habit and making that a practice that is upheld by every individual, that it becomes your second nature, and that's how you introduce yourself and you affirm people. And also it is one way that we are able to show respect. And so it is something that so many folks have a lot of anxiety about. Well, I don't want to seem, whether it's disrespectful by not already knowing, or I don't want to ask and put this person on the spot if they're not comfortable answering. And so to address those two separate kind of anxieties that we may be bringing into the space, are that it is always the most respectful thing that anyone can do to ask what someone's name and their pronouns are, and also share what their own name and pronouns are. Because in not making an assumption about what someone's pronouns are, you're showing that you respect that individual enough to want to know how to affirm them. So even if the individual has never been asked what their pronouns are before, by you saying, or for instance, if I come into a space and I say, my name is Mixlex Horwitz, I use they, them pronouns. What's your name? What are your pronouns? So they may say, oh, my name is Jordan. And they may stumble and not necessarily know what pronouns are. I said, oh, well, if you're not in the room, would you like me to refer to you solely with your name? Or are you comfortable with me referring to you using they, them pronouns, or she, her, or he, him pronouns? So if you left the room and said, oh, they went to get coffee, or oh, he went to get coffee, or oh, she went to get coffee, or Jordan went to get coffee. So you can give these brief examples for folks who may not have been asked pronouns before. The response you may get is, oh, I use she, her pronouns. My name is Jordan. Or, I actually don't know. Let's just use my name. Or let's check in later. So you can get so many different responses from folks. It may be the fact that it hasn't been made a common practice in your workspace, or also maybe that some folks are actively still questioning what feels right and authentic. And so being able to then in team meetings, every once in a while, still check in, say name, pronouns, go around one more time, and also creating the space where people do not have to share their name and or pronouns and can skip. And so then if you are a supervisor, or if you are someone who is a team leader in some capacity, and you have colleagues who skip the question or have had changes to whether it's the name or the pronouns that they're sharing, making sure that we're checking in with everyone, especially folks who have these changes, so that if there are changes in language that should be used to be affirming, we are making sure that we are actively aware of what those changes are. So kind of staying in constant conversation, and also making sure that in these spaces, I would say the main thing that can truly help with self-advocacy is enlisting your trusted others. So whether that is one person at work or a small group or your entire team, and being able to lean on them when if you want to go by your affirming name at work, but you don't know if it's safe to, do that with your affirming people, with your safe people at first, no matter how many folks they may be, until you test out the waters and see if you are ready to then share with your team at large, whether that's name and pronouns, whatever that may be. But I cannot emphasize enough the impact of support from even just one or a small handful of other people at work, especially if there aren't policies, there aren't inclusive policies, because you deserve to be affirmed. And so finding those people, it's unbelievably important. And if you do not have those folks at work, lean on your chosen or your given family, whoever they may be, to affirm you as you are navigating work, which may not be as inclusive or affirming in the ways that you deserve them to be.
I like that. When I think you hit on a couple of really great things in your answer here, which is like, the idea that you kind of constantly keep up on these sorts of things. Because if you think about it, it's not, and that sounds like a lot of labor, right? It sounds like I'm going to have to be constantly asking everyone and double checking and, going through my Rolodex, unless you're old enough like me to remember Rolodexes. Sorry, that was a very dated reference, but it's not really, right? It's not extra work. It's like realizing that, the guy that works down the hall from you, whose name is Michael, suddenly decided he wants to go by Mike. Okay. It's easy. You're not going to pitch a fit because he's always been Michael and how dare he want to change it. It's okay. And if you make a misstep and you misgender someone or you use an incorrect name, just apologize. It's not hard, right? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that you wanted to be called by a different name. What is that?
Exactly. So much of it has to do with accountability. And so what does that look like in all different settings? So no one is perfect. That is not the ask. The ask is that we hold ourselves as individuals accountable and also those around us. And I know that holding anyone accountable, depending on the individual, can be difficult, right? But especially it can be difficult, and maybe there's anxiety connected with holding others accountable. So if you hear someone use the incorrect name or incorrect pronouns, not wanting to cause, if it's conflict or to draw attention, whatever it may be. And so importantly, when we are correcting people who are making a mistake, that is not a conflict. That is simply taking that accountability piece and putting it into practice. So whether or not that is correcting in the moment, saying, oh, you mean Jordan, who's over using XYZ pronouns, and just slipping in the correction there. Or if it is more comfortable, for whatever the reason may be, to then in an email or a phone call or stepping aside at lunch, whatever, maybe saying, hey, just a reminder, Jordan uses they, them pronouns. Mm-hmm. There are so many different ways in which we are responsible. So as allies, there is the responsibility to advocate and hold others accountable when mistakes are made. And also in less direct ways, if you're hearing someone ask a colleague about, oh, do you have a girlfriend, per se, right? Asking in a both cisnormative and heteronormative capacity, if there is a man asking another man about having a girlfriend, you could in that moment say, oh, what are you asking them about, a partner? Or stepping aside later and saying, hey, here are some examples of gender neutral substitutes that you can use when you're talking about relational terms. And then not only give the example of partner or spouse, then also say here, child or sibling, and give these other examples. So there wasn't necessarily a mistake being made by binary language being used in that instance, but we don't know if that person does have a partner who identifies as a woman. And also in using that, it's creating a space where other people who are present and listening hear this heteronormative language being used, and therefore may not be comfortable if they are queer themselves, and then sharing that they actually have a partner and not a girlfriend. And so what are the ways in which our inaction in helping folks use inclusive language is then in that silence still creating environments where heteronormativity is what is upheld in the ideal, to the detriment and the erasure and unfortunately invalidating the existence of queer people in that space. And in the same instance with when cis norms are upheld, to the detriment of trans and non-binary folks existing in the space as well.
I like that. Okay. So let's talk about when it comes to being out in the workplace. We had a question, a specific one that had asked, how do we balance visibility and being assertive about our pronouns without being tagged as difficult or extra? I am extra, but I want it to be seen as a positive, not creating emotional labor for my peers. I think this is a very, very important question. And when I read it, my first take was, what you had talked about earlier, right? Where if you are not part of if you're not part of this specific demographic, but you have a certain amount of, let's call it privilege, capital, whatever you want to call it at work, as like a cisgender white person, I absolutely feel the responsibility to lead from example, right? Of saying something like, hi, my name's Meg. I use she, her pronouns. How about you? When you are the person in the hot seat, right? If you are trying to advocate for yourself and make sure that something like asking pronouns or respecting someone's preferred pronouns is being seen as extra, how should you handle that? If you are not coming from a position of privilege or power, but are trying to advocate for yourself, how could people watching do that for themselves?
Absolutely. Such an important question. So lots of different pieces here. One thing that I would recommend is in presenting your pronouns in different capacities, and also in enlisting your trusted allies to do the same, right? So that way there are multiple people and the onus is not simply on the queer and trans folks. So whether that's in your Zoom name, your email signature, if you have a business card, do you have pronoun pins that you can wear? What does that look like? Do you have a water bottle that you can put a sticker on or on your laptop? If you want to use other imagery, do you have let's say a non-binary or a trans flag that you put in a pencil holder that's on your desk? So there are so many ways in which we can incorporate visibility. Or do you have a safe space sticker or poster that says gender diversity is welcome here? One, because that's affirming of yourself, which is extremely important. And two, you're simultaneously creating the space where other colleagues or wherever you may be see that imagery and see that they are also welcomed in your space. So you're also building community in the same vein. And so doing that for yourself, of course, that is something that you are safe and comfortable to do. So remembering that, unfortunately, where we are right now, knowing what the policies that are in place, so you are able to protect your job, your financial stability, and your safety, right? While also affirming yourself. And that all those factors come into play and are important to know as we're making these decisions. But like I said, we want to enlist our trusted allies. So have those folks put their pronouns in their email signature. When they're introducing themselves to others, also introduce themselves with their name and their pronouns. If they hear or are with you when someone uses the incorrect name or pronouns, rather than it being you who corrects them, you can have a conversation with your friends who are there prior to saying, this is what I would like from you as my supporter, as my ally. If I'm present and someone doesn't use my pronouns, I would like for you to interject and correct them. I do not want to do that. Or after the fact, if something happened and it was a one-on-one interaction or no one corrected in the moment, you can reach back out to your allies and say, would you be comfortable having a conversation, whether email or in person, with this individual, reminding them of my name and pronouns? And so what are the ways in which you may say, I'm going to just jump in and correct this person because that's who I am and that's what I'm going to do, versus that sometimes can be a lot. And so I'm going to ask the other allies at work to assist me in that capacity. And also knowing that whether or not you feel comfortable or have the energy to be the one correcting, that you are still valid. And so still seeking that affirmation and support from the supporters that you have, whether at work or not. And then the other very, very important piece is that, and I know we kind of already touched on this too, but just want to further emphasize that you are not creating an emotional burden on any individual by asking, and I would even say it's okay to demand to be respected and treated with dignity and respect. Our names, our pronouns, our identity terms, our bodies, our identities are all sacred and divine. And if someone makes a mistake, whether that is purposeful or a consequence of that inattentive nature that exists, or the fact that we've been ingrained with binaries for our entire lives. And so it will take practice and mistakes happen. And that is okay as long as we are able to learn and grow together. Right. So no matter what the situation is, being respected is not an option. It's something that every single person deserves. And so I totally hear feeling that asking for your name and your pronouns to be respected can feel like asking people to take on an emotional burden, when in fact, every person is being respected in their own ways with their name, their pronouns, their identity terms, the ways that we talk about their family, their friends, or the way that we uplift them and their work diligence, whatever it may be, right? There are so many ways that we are constantly affirming and respecting people. And for queer and trans folks, particularly, name and pronouns is a part of that if it's something that has shifted and changed. So you are not asking for something more than what other people are already getting. It may simply be when folks make mistakes, we need to make it a practice in the workplace, that it is adding an extra piece of this is how we respect people, but you are still not an emotional burden by any means.
I love that. We had a question in the chat. Jake had asked about if there's a more appropriate approach to a situation if someone takes offense to you asking their pronouns or identity. And when I first thought of this, I kind of thought like it sort of goes both ways, right? I have asked people for their pronouns. Generally, the people that have responded negatively have been straight white men of a certain age range. So I've seen it, on the behalf of people who are not part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but I've also seen the opposite work, right? Where you ask someone their pronouns or you make a mistake and immediately you are kind of put on the defensive, right? Because you don't want to be, insulting someone or whatever. Do you think that there's an approach that works best in those situations where there has been a breakdown or some kind of misstep, whether on behalf of the asker or the askee?
Yeah, absolutely. So with everything, it's very situationally dependent. However, generally speaking, if someone does not want to share their pronouns, then I guess there's a lot of different instances. So even just giving the caveat that saying, oh, my name's Lex, I use they, them pronouns, what's your name and pronouns? And then if the person and then in giving the previous explanation, I said like, oh, I can just refer to you as your name, or here are the other pronouns plus neopronouns that I can use if you're not present. And if that person, for whatever reason is, let's say they are offended or they share that they are offended, you then simply say, I ask every person because that's how I show that I want to respect and treat everyone in a way that is affirming and welcomes them in my space. So you put out the explanation, the disclaimer that in asking, it is based and rooted in the fact that I am cultivating an environment where everyone is welcome and included. And by me not making an assumption, that is already me showing that I respect you and want you to be able to have the autonomy and the self-determination that every individual deserves in this space, and for me to respect that and use that and not make those assumptions. So very importantly, and I love this about the mind, it's fascinating. When I ask people when we're in the realm of assumptions, so we will always make assumptions, right? In psychology, we learn evolutionarily, it saves our brain energy. There are so many reasons why, right? If a hairy creature was sprinting towards a cave person, they're not going to take the time to evaluate what that may be, right? Their brain is going to be like, I'm in danger. And so going to make some assumptions and run away. We still have that evolutionarily wired assumption making, especially when it comes to how we are interacting with other people for so many different reasons. And so when I say that we should not be, when we are looking at assumptions, it's not that we should not be making assumptions. That is going to happen. That's how we are evolutionarily currently hardwired. But what I'm asking folks to do is not act on those assumptions. So when we're asking people for pronouns, we're showing in that instance, we're not acting on an assumption of what their gender identity may be. Because we also don't know, based on someone's appearance, what their pronouns are or what their gender identity is. Because people who use binary pronouns may identify as a binary gender or gender expansive or a combination of both. So we also don't know if someone uses he, him pronouns. Maybe in affirming spaces, they use he, they pronouns, or in even safer affirming spaces, they use they, them pronouns. And so we don't want to make assumptions about other people's identity. We don't want to act on the assumptions that we are making about other people's identities. So being able to have the attention and the acknowledgement of, oh, I'm making an assumption about that person walking down the street because I'm using gendered or binary terms. But what I can actually say is, okay, that's a person, and this is how my assumptions are not going to be acted upon. And so just being aware of the fact that assumptions come into play in almost everything that we do and just not acting on those assumptions. And one way that we aren't acting on assumptions is through asking for name and pronouns and even giving that disclaimer that this is how I show that I respect you and respect everyone.
I love that. I love the idea of just stating like, hey, I'm trying to show respect. This is the way I'm trying to do it. Personally, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of stuff, right? Like you want to make sure that you're being professional and wording things appropriately, but sometimes you can just kind of cut to the chase of like, I want to make sure that I'm being respectful. Is this accurate or not? Is this correct or not? You know, people are far more likely to entertain questions when they know they're not coming from a negative place, right? If you can set that baseline and say, I am curious and want to make sure I'm doing this correctly, people are far more willing to kind of give you that leeway, right? They want, as long as they know that you're trying to understand, you're not asking questions to poke holes or to be a jerk. That's what they want, right? That setting that level is never going to be a bad thing. To reiterate, I want to be respectful. Tell me how I can be respectful of you.
Absolutely. And also another piece that would just be so impactful for every community that, and of course, same instance, be aware of policies and protection. And if you have that resource group or HR, right, being aware of how this may impact you. But as a best practice in physical spaces, primarily that we're navigating, having signage, inclusive signage. So at the entrance of your office building or your conference room, saying gender diversity is welcome here, or something more general. LGBTQIA people are welcomed here. Like, we want you to be thriving in our space. So having some type of generalized statement, whether it's at the entrance of your workspace or just on different reminders across the workspace, so that every individual, whether they are a member of the community or not, are aware of the shared expectations and values that exist in the workspace. So then also when name and pronouns are being asked, it's connected to the fact that we have explicitly shown that our space is welcoming and inclusive of all people. Also showing all the queer and trans folks that they are welcome there, whether or not they feel that this space has actually taken more action to being inclusive where they can be out. It's another question, but this is a first step that every workspace has readily available. If you have a printer, and you can put the template and print it out and hang it up, right? This is an accessible way that we can show that our spaces are inclusive and affirming, which is also especially important when we only have access to binary facilities such as restrooms or showers or whatever it may be, and putting an additional sign above the binary signs, for instance, for a woman's restroom, saying similarly, gender diversity is welcome here. Please use whichever facility most closely aligns with your identity. So in that capacity, the writing itself is acknowledging, putting the disclaimer that we only have binary facilities. However, you are encouraged and supported in using the facility that most closely aligns with your identity. And so even putting that into further practice in a team meeting or an email, I don't even know what it would be, but just making sure that there is another kind of disclaimer that says, hey, our facilities, we only have one single stall restroom on X floor, and here are where the other facilities are. We want you to know that all members of the LGBTQIA+ community are welcome here. Please use whichever facility most closely aligns with your identity. If you are looking for resources or supports, here are the contact people. If you want a resource group, this is where you find them. If you have questions, so being as explicit as possible or requesting from supervisors or your boss that you need access to these resources or for these things to be put into practice. They are here and they are ready and they are tangible to start to create these spaces.
Ooh. Goodness, I can't tell you how much I love this. We are at time, and I know this always goes way too quickly. So I just want to take 1 second here to say thank you, Lex. It has been wonderful to get to learn from you for the last hour. But is there anything else you want to share with our audience before we leave today?
Yes. So no matter where you are on your journey as a queer or trans person or ally, thank you for being here. Know that you are just so unbelievably valid, that there are resources out there for you and you are not alone. So if I can help in any way, whether that is through answering questions, providing resources, please do not hesitate to reach out. My website is www.lexhorwitz.com. So that's LEXHORWITZ.com. You can also connect with me on social media. I'm on have a community page on Facebook, Mix Lex Horwitz, Mix, which is the gender neutral prefix that can be used instead of Mr., Miss, or Mrs. And on social media at Lex_Horwitz. And of course, if I can come and support you and your community, I do trainings, workshops, programming on queer identities, topics, and issues, similar to what we're doing today. And with this being an hour, there are so many topics that you can get into on later dates. I also do consulting to help folks with building curriculum or addressing policies or different gaps in how we can be supportive and affirming, and also public speaking, sharing my story as a queer, trans, Jewish human out in space, in work, in athletics, whatever it may be. And so if there are ways that I can support you and bring my work as an educator, consultant, public speaker, to just be able to support you wherever you may need, please do not hesitate to reach out. Also, my email spells out queerresistlex@gmail.com. So QUEERRESISTLEX@gmail.com. And I'm here to be a resource. This work is so unbelievably important to me. That's why I started my small business as a queer educator, to be able to support folks. And so if I can be there for you, I would like to be. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lex. And a huge thank you to our audience members as well. I wouldn't have a job without y'all, so I'm always grateful that you come to events like this. But even more so, if this was your 500th Power to Fly event, thank you so much for joining us again. I love to see our returning members. If this was your first Power to Fly event, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you felt welcome. I hope you loved it. And I hope that we get to see you again soon on a future event. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy. And we cannot wait to see you